Gingerbread. While mainly associated with Christmas, its storied past reveals its universal lore across cultures and centuries. While it was mainly used for medicinal and culinary purposes, I discovered a scientific-ish use for gingerbread that made daily life more convenient. While this is by no means a comprehensive history, I hope to uncover the basic story of gingerbread as it relates to colonial America and its European roots. And of course, we are going to make some gingerbread from the late 18th century featuring potash. I have no clue what I'm doing, so this is going to be a good one. But first, historic context as always. No one truly knows exactly where the ginger plant originated. What we do know is that it came from somewhere in Asia. The first known use of the spice was as a food preservative for venison. Its early use in China was mostly medicinal. The Arabs brought ginger to the Romans and Greeks and then limited its supply, causing it to be as valuable as gold. The Roman Empire also levied a luxury tax on ginger. Pliny the Elder wrote describing banquets featuring gingerbread. Ginger most likely reached England via the Romans long before the Crusades, and certainly by the Crusades, it was widespread across Europe. Venice was the main trading hub for the spice trade from the Middle Ages to the 15th century, when it lost its foothold to the exploration age of the Spanish and Portuguese. Marco Polo brought it back from the Far East. It became the most traded spice after pepper. In the 1800s, Salem, Massachusetts became the #1 spice port in the whole world. This ginger craze didn't start to wane until the 18th century. However, one confection made from this spice became popular in almost every European country across the centuries: gingerbread. As to how gingerbread came to be baked, no one knows for certain who, when, or where. According to the French, gingerbread was brought west by the Chinese with their honey bread called mikong that was included in the rations of Genghis Khan's army in the 10th century. Some say it was brought to Europe in the 10th century by Armenian monk St. Gregory of Nicopolis. Some postulate it was introduced to Europe via the Crusades in the 11th century. The name and composition of medieval gingerbread came to the English via medicine, not the culinary arts. Gingerbratis was a medical paste for the immune system, stomach ailments, and such. Bratis, B-R-A-T-I-S. However, many mistook brati for breadcrumbs, bread, B-R-E-D-E, instead of parsnips, which was what was really used. According to the research of food historian Karen Hess, the earliest English recipe for gingerbread dates from 1430, but she found another recipe for gingerbread in all but name that dates from a 1400 copy of an older manuscript of recipes, making it older than 1400, which has a recipe for spices, honey, and breadcrumbs.
Medieval gingerbread, being based on an electuary, which is a medicinal paste sweetened with honey, sugar, or other sweetener, was quite different from how we think of gingerbread today. In my research, it is described as being more of a candy. Bread made with honey and spices, or honey cakes, are an early version of gingerbread, though ginger may not have been necessarily used. For example, the 1470 recipe for gingerbread doesn't call for ginger, which Karen Hess surmises was an oversight. These types of discrepancies were common.
In medieval Europe, gingerbread began to be baked in increasingly elaborate designs, served at banquets of the royalty. Gingerbread bakers were seen as artists, not mere cooks. It was really serious business. In 1571, France started their first gingerbread guild. In Nuremberg, to this day the gingerbread capital of the world, German gingerbread bakers needed to train for 2 years before they were allowed to bake gingerbread on their own. Almost every country in Europe had their own version of gingerbread.
I am preemptively apologizing if I mispronounced any of these words. I did my best and used as many online resources as I could, but alas, I probably made a mistake. Sweden has spekulas, France, pain de pisse, Sweden, pepparkakor, Germany, Lebkuchen, Poland, perniki, Russia, pryaniki.
Just to name a few examples. All of these countries made elaborate gingerbread molds, mostly made out of wood. You can see many of them today in museums around the world. They are quite spectacular, considering that they were all hand-carved. Speaking of Russia, when Peter the Great was born, a model of the Kremlin was presented made out of 150 to 200 pounds of gingerbread, reportedly. As time went on and ingredients became more affordable, gingerbread became a universal treat loved by the king and beggar alike. It is also important to note that unlike today, gingerbread was a year-round treat used for all sorts of special occasions throughout the year. Weddings, anniversaries, holidays, big dinners, births, medicinally, or just because. Different shapes were used in different parts of the year. In the spring, you'd see flowers. In the autumn, animals. As gingerbread became more accessible, the motifs of the molds changed as well. They went from portraying scenes of the rich and royal to religious themes, and then by the 18th century, when practically everyone had access to gingerbread, scenes from the lives of peasants. It wasn't until the 17th century that flour and eggs were added to the recipe by the French and Germans. According to Karen Hess, the breadcrumb version of gingerbread left the annals of British history in the 17th century to be replaced with the gingerbread we are familiar with today. Honey and sugar were used as sweeteners across most of Europe. England also used treacle, or British molasses, the uncrystallized syrup that forms during sugar processing. Molasses, on the other hand, is a thick, dark syrup that forms during sugar making, which is sweeter and richer in flavor than treacle, and was used as a sweetener, a much cheaper sweetener at that, once the colonies were established in the New World. So this brings us to America. The first recipes for gingerbread were brought over on the Mayflower. The many immigrants that came to live in the New World brought their recipes and their precious cookie molds as well, such as German baker Christopher Ludwig, who came to Philadelphia in 1754 and established a bakery before fighting in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. Today, we are making gingerbread from 1796, once again from American Cookery by Amelia Simmons, the same cookbook I used to make those early American pies. The link is in the description below if you are so inclined. Amelia's recipes feature not only the first American gingerbread recipes, but the first molasses gingerbread recipe to appear in a cookbook, and the first cookbook recipe known to call for a leavening agent, potash, also known as pearl ash, chemically named potassium carbonate. In the introduction to the reprint of American Cookery, food historian Mary Tolford Wilson states that pearl ash was made by American women, and purportedly its origins can be traced to an unnamed American woman, by boiling the ashes from their fireplaces to use as a leavening agent that became the predecessor to bicarbonate of soda or baking soda. This had a great impact on baking in Europe as well. Traditional German gingerbread recipes use potash, for example. Today, we are baking two gingerbread recipes from American Cookery: Molasses Gingerbread and one called Gingerbread Cakes. Both call for pearl ash. Now, a lightning round of fun facts about gingerbread before we roll up our sleeves and start stamping. Queen Elizabeth I is sometimes credited with the invention of the gingerbread man when she presented her guests and court with gingerbread likenesses of themselves, but this is doubtful. The Germans had been making more elaborate gingerbread than the English ever did before Queen Elizabeth's reign, so while it is a fun tale, it is probably apocryphal. Germany has the longest history of making flat-shaped gingerbread, so they probably invented the gingerbread man. While gingerbread started as a treat for only the aristocracy, by the 18th century, gingerbread was sold at stalls at fairs across Europe, especially in Germany, where there would be rows and rows of booths of gingerbread. While high-quality gingerbread was quite hard and could last years, the cheap gingerbread sold at these fairs were softer and not that great. Think of these gingerbread stalls like cotton candy or hot dog stands today, yet people still love to buy it. The stalls were always the most decorated at the fair, and they would attract so many hungry passerbyers. Some gingerbread was even gilt in fake gold, also known as Dutch metal, to add a little bling to the display. The expression to take the gilt off the gingerbread meant to destroy an illusion, or in modern parlance, to take the red pill. In England, one gingerbread vendor went down in history. His name was Ford, but he became known as Titty Ditty Doll from one of his many songs he sang to hawk his wares.
I found evidence of this infamous gingerbread peddler in several sources, and I believed him to be English until I came across this political cartoon calling him the Great French Gingerbread Baker. However, it is a political cartoon, so I can't take everything literally, but just some food for thought.
During the Romantic period of the late 18th century, gingerbread was even used as greeting cards, which I think we should definitely start doing now because that sounds awesome. There was a custom in some English villages for young women in search of a husband to eat a gingerbread shaped as a groom at the fair to give them good luck in finding one. I wonder how often that worked. The last fun gingerbread fact I'd like to share is my favorite. To the Germans, who really took ownership of the whole gingerbread thing, not only used it medicinally and for their elaborate confections, but to tell the weather. It was common practice to stamp out a gingerbread man in the shape of a general and nail him to the front doorway right before you left the house. If he was hard, the humidity was low. If soft, it was very humid and rain was ahead. Every morning, people would ask before leaving the house, "What does the general say?" I just think that is so charming and creative, and I absolutely love it, and yes, we are doing it. The history of gingerbread is encyclopedic, and I've barely scratched the surface. I haven't even touched upon the tradition of the gingerbread house, which will be a whole episode and topic in and of itself one day, but I wanted to mention some background so you can appreciate how important gingerbread is to American, British, and European culture. Now let's get on our aprons, dear artisans, and start baking. First one we're making is classic molasses gingerbread. 1 tablespoon of cinnamon, 1 spoonful of ginger, some coriander or allspice. Put to 4 teaspoons pearl ash dissolved in half a pint of water, 4 pounds flour, 1 quart molasses, 4 ounces butter. If in summer, rub the butter in. If in winter, warm the butter and molasses and pour to the spiced flour. Knead till well and stiff. The more the better, the lighter and whiter it will be. Bake a brisk 15 minutes, don't scorch. Before it is put in, wash it with whites and sugar beat together. Food historian Karen Hess wrote the annotations to Martha Washington's Book of Cookery and Book of Sweetmeats, and she mentions the use of pearl ash in recipes and says to let the dough sit for a couple of hours for it to ferment. I also know that when you make gingerbread prints that you have to let the dough sit for a few hours before you put them in the oven because it helps harden the dough and restores the print. Because if you do it too soon, as it bakes, the flour spreading in the oven will diminish the design.
One of the reproduction cookie molds that I purchased came with a little recipe booklet, and in the booklet for gingerbread, it said to let the printed dough sit for 8 to 12 hours, which I did not have. But you will see how it all turned out. After all, this is an experiment.
I am cutting this recipe in a third because we're making a second recipe. I already did my conversions. They're pretty much all the same except for liquid measure. The colonies were using British units, which later became imperial units in 1824. They were more or less the same. Once America became independent, they were still using them in 1796 when this recipe was written. So once again, I am using Italian pastry flour, which is type 00. It is finer. I like how my desserts come out with this.
The recipe calls for 4 pounds of flour, but I was cutting it into a third. So that means it's 1.333333336 pounds of flour, which on the scale was about 1 pound, 6-ish ounces.
Now, a word on cinnamon. As I mentioned in the apple pie episode, in America, most of our cinnamon is really cassia. It's darker, it survives better in heat. I am using true cinnamon, which is Ceylon cinnamon. I like the flavor better, but it doesn't survive as much from the heat. So I might put a little bit more because I do know that it does burn off a little bit. So I'm gonna do 2 teaspoons.
Between the coriander and the allspice, I chose allspice. I ended up doing half a teaspoon. I added 3.5 teaspoons of ginger. Of course, all these spices are to our own particular tastes. I also have no clue why I'm making really weird facial expressions, so I apologize, but it is kind of funny. Once the spices and flour were mixed together, I melted 1.33333 ounces of butter into 12.8 ounces of molasses.
The last ingredient is the pearl ash, the potash. Now, the smallest container of potassium carbonate I could find is this ramen supply company brand, Kansui powder type 4. I had no idea that this was used to make ramen noodles. I can see why they call it pearl ash.
Unlike baking soda, the pearl ash has to be dissolved in water. A third of the recipe came to about 3 ounces of water and 1.33333 teaspoons, or 1 1/3. I just filled up about a third of that teaspoon. I used room temperature tap water. It dissolved pretty easily. Once the potash was dissolved, I added it to the flour and spice mix and then spooned in the molasses and butter. Mixing everything together was a bit arduous. It was quite stiff, but it ended up mixing well together in the end. I was really yearning for silicone spatulas when I was doing this, but it really wasn't that bad with the wood. It just wasn't as neat and tidy as I would have liked it. As with the pie project, I am only using utensils, techniques, and technology that would have existed in 1796. Obviously, stainless steel didn't exist, but in lieu of metal that would have existed, I am using it. Kneading the dough was a slog. The dough was very, very sticky, and in the beginning, I don't think I was adding enough flour, so that certainly didn't help my cause. I started using some of the wooden utensils to help mix the dough, and as I was adding the flour, it made it a little easier to deal with, and as you can see, it's starting to kind of congeal more together as you would want it to. It took me about an hour to get this into a state where it was not only very rigid, but you could actually work with it.
Okay, so had a little bio break and that's sitting. So it looks like it's going to end up sitting for 2 hours anyway. So I'm just going to let these sit for 2 hours. So now the second recipe Gingerbread cakes or butter and sugar gingerbread. 3 pounds of flour, a grated nutmeg, 2 ounces of ginger, 1 pound of sugar, 2 small spoonfuls of pearl ash dissolved in cream, 1 pound butter, 4 eggs, knead it stiff, shape it to your fancy, bake 15 minutes. We're cutting this in half. So my quantities would be a pound and a half of flour, a half a pound of sugar, 1/2 of a grated nutmeg, 1 ounce of ginger, 1.5 small spoons of pearl ash in cream, a half a pound of butter, and 2 eggs. I don't know what to say a small spoonful is.
I added all the ingredients into one bowl. As far as using a digital scale, that's the scale that I had. They would have used balances back then. But like I said, I am trying to use the technology that they would have had, and they would have had a scale. I'm just using a modern version of it.
Okay, that's it, just half a teaspoon. I'll put a little bit more. I'm using half and half to dissolve it. A little bit more for good measure.
I added 8 ounces of unsalted butter, that's 2 sticks. Unsalted because even though they preserve their salt with butter, they would have washed it off before using it.
I'm actually gonna just beat the eggs. Well, this is certainly white gingerbread.
As with the molasses gingerbread, I started mixing it with a wooden spoon first, but then I really had to get my hands dirty. The reason why I'm wearing a glove on one hand is because I did kind of nick my hand a little bit on the nutmeg grater, so I just wanted to protect the batter from my blood. It was very crumbly at first, so I did have to add in some more half and half until it got wet enough that I was able to form it into a whole piece, and then I kneaded it. But I probably needed to knead it longer, but my hands were already so sore from kneading for an hour prior to that I had to just do what I could.
This is pretty good. I'm gonna add more flour to it once we roll it out, so let it sit. I'll see you in 2 hours.
According to Karen Hess's research, and the recipes in Martha Washington's book of Cookery and Sweetmeats, for a colored gingerbread like molasses gingerbread, you want the thickness to be between 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 of an inch. In addition to the reproduction wood and resin mold, I will be using 2 reproduction cookie molds made out of metal that were forged at Colonial Williamsburg. I'm also using a cookie cutter from the 1950s or 60s that was my grandmother's. The details are not etched in very well, and you will see the result of that. I discovered that when using the bigger metal cookie molds, the more effective technique was to press the dough into the mold instead of pressing the mold into the dough. This yielded a much better print and used a lot less elbow grease. Since the molasses gingerbread dough was so thick and stiff, it was a dream cutting out the shape. It looks great, doesn't it? I was really happy with how it came out. The soldier had so much detail that cutting it out was a bit hairy. I didn't cut out every single detail because the cookie would have been too thin and I was worried it was going to break. I kind of already broke some of it and had to repair it. For the mid-century cowboy, we will call him, no matter how much I pressed on that cookie cutter, the details of his little pistols and his little handkerchief did not transfer. However, it's a perfect shape for the kids to make their own gingerbread men. For the reproduction wood and resin mold, it took a little bit of practice. I had to kind of press it back and forth, but the prints were spectacular. Whatever dough was left over and not big enough to use one of the molds or cookie cutters, I used one of my biscuit cutters, which I have in various sizes. Waste not, want not. I repeated the same rolling and printing process on the white gingerbread. For a white gingerbread, the thickness should be no more than 1/4 of an inch. However, since the dough was wetter and not as stiff, cutting out the gingerbread man and the soldier was tougher since the dough had more give. I had to skip on some details of both because of that. On the upside, the prints came out better on the wood mold, much more detailed. Next time, I would definitely spend more time kneading the dough and adding more flour. I think that would have remediated this sort of little issue. However, because there's butter and eggs in it, it's still going to be wetter than the molasses gingerbread. I buttered the baking sheets before putting the cookies on. I just used my fingers because it was a lot easier than using a wooden spoon or a knife. The molasses gingerbread recipe called for a wash of egg whites and sugar before baking. I baked at 350 for 15 minutes, rotating the sheets halfway through. I didn't use the pizza stone method to mimic a stone oven as I did for the pies because the stone wasn't big enough for the cookie sheet and it would have taken forever to bake all those cookies. I repeated the same baking process with the white gingerbread, except I didn't put a wash on it because the recipe didn't call for it. Examining the molasses gingerbread, some of the print was lost in baking, so next time I am going to let these sit overnight to harden more, or the 8 to 12 prescribed hours, depending on what time you're making them. You could make them in the morning and let them sit all day and bake them at night. I wonder if the combination of the molasses and the potash also contributed to this, since the gingerbread is a little on the squishy side and it rose quite a bit in baking, but I'm no chemist, so I don't know. However, despite this, I am tickled pink with how these turned out, and I think they look super cute, and there are plenty of details that you can see. I mean, you can see the change purse, which I think is absolutely adorable, and the detail on his boots, so it wasn't a total loss. I'm just thinking in terms of improvement for next time. The prints on the little wood print came out really good, despite the fact that the rising of the dough caused some of the detail to be lost, but I am also pretty happy about it. There was also a little bit of loss from the egg wash. Some of it kind of singed a bit on a few, but overall, I think it looks really cute, and when you look at them, you can see the design, so I am happy about that. For the white gingerbread, you can tell the print didn't come out as detailed, and you can see, especially in the soldier, how I struggled to cut the little details out of the dough. So perhaps this definitely needed to be kneaded more and needed to wait overnight, but maybe this just isn't the dough for this type of figure. However, for a first go, I think they came out great. The wood prints came out amazing, considering I didn't let this sit for 8 to 12 hours. I love the detail that came out, and they're just quite charming, and I'm amazed you can see the details so well considering how light the dough is.
It's very chewy, but very good. It did rise quite a bit, and I guess the molasses does make it chewier. It tastes like a combination butter, sugar, ginger cookie. Very interesting. Really good. A little harder than the other gingerbread. I could see this being used as a barometer for sure.
The white soldier is much harder than the molasses soldier. See, there's kind of some movement in him. And according to one of the sources I read that spoke about the gingerbread barometers, said you were to use bad gingerbread, meaning it's soft and not stiff. I guess because the hard gingerbread will just stay hard. It won't be affected by the humidity as much if it's well made. I'm going to go with the molasses gingerbread because I think it'll be easier to nail it up. It'll be more forgiving. I think this will just crumble if I nail it. Well, we'll see if it gets softer if it's higher than 37%, and we'll see if it gets much harder if it's pretty much zero humidity. But this is just a bunch of fun. I mean, come on, it's not science. Just a fun little experiment just to add some whimsy to the day. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And if you are so inclined, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. Thanks so much, and I'll see you on our next crafting misadventure through history. This app's for I will go forth and learn the results. And if not, then I lost my train of thought because Susie jumped up on. You're gonna have to go. You're gonna have to go. You're gonna have to go into your little room, buddy.